Hello, I'm Tom Bradby and welcome to Talking Politics. Robert and Anushka are with me to dig into the issues dominating the political agenda. Top of the list this week was whether Elon Musk is really going to donate $100 million to Nigel Farage's Reform Party, and the PM under pressure over the resignation of his Transport Secretary. Well, I'm joined, as always, by Robert and Anushka. Where should we start? I think it's irresistible to start start with Elon Musk. I mean, is it just rubbish, or is there a possibility either of you think that he's going to donate $100 million or anything like it to Nigel Farage's party?
I mean, I don't think this story is based on someone chatting to Elon Musk and him saying, I'm going to donate the money, or chatting to Nigel Farage and him saying, I've had a conversation, because he's been clear that he's had no conversation. Does Elon Musk hate Keir Starmer? Has he got a history of giving a lot of money to politics? Are there ways he could find a way to give money to British politics? It's all very enticing and possible. It doesn't sound like it's about to happen. He's not a British citizen, which is one way of giving money. And he could, in theory, through the British arm of X, his social media company, give money. But even Nigel Farage thinks the proportionality rules wouldn't let him get to 100 million. Although $100 million, I should say, £80 million. If he did give that amount, it would blow any other donation that has ever been given in British politics out of the water. I mean, there's a report coming out next week, I think, or soon, from the think tank, the IPPR, which is all about how unprecedented it is that we now have £1 million and £5 million donations. And, you know, I think we should mention Nigel Farage says he'd take it. He'd take it and he'd spend it.
Is there a political party that wouldn't take it?
Well, I think the significance of it is just about the extent to which reform is, you know, really the big factor in British politics at the moment. And, you know, whether or not Musk ends up giving him a sum of money which for a British party would be enormous, for Elon Musk is literally small change when you have a $350 billion personal fortune. You know, 100 million is the equivalent to you and me of a fiver. And I mean, so
which is a mind-blowing fact.
No, it is. I mean, but it also just, one of the things that I think politicians all around the world have just not taken seriously. Funny enough, I started writing about this 15 years ago, was that when individuals accumulate fortunes on this scale, it distorts politics, it distorts democracy, because they have power beyond anything that we've actually experienced from wealthy people since the late 19th century. And, you know, we've been sleepwalking into a world in which, you know, Elon Musk could have, if he wanted to, through reform, the most extraordinary impact on British politics. But even without that, reform has momentum that should be scaring both the Tories and Labour. I mean, just one little fact you may or may not have noticed. Actually, Nigel Farage doesn't devote an enormous amount of resource to TikTok, but he's already got 1 million followers, right? It happened a couple of days ago. And one of the things that's really striking, the last TikTok thing I saw from him, which was only a couple of days ago, is he goes to this event, because I spoke to him about it last night. He goes to this event, Central Hall, Westminster, in which a load of sixth formers all turn up. These are young people, mostly male, actually, weirdly, but apparently it's an annual event. He says he's been going for years. And these are young people. They loved him. They put a little TikTok up about, you know, and this guy comes on the stage, wants a selfie with him. And the way that particularly young men seem to be, supporting him personally and reform is an important factor in British politics at the moment.
I think there's a few things there. One is, I think we can all imagine Elon Musk making this donation. I mean, whether it's something he's actively considered or not, you can see, well, if he is enjoying his involvement in US politics and it's a drop in the ocean of his wealth, kind of potentially, why wouldn't he? Although I wonder if he does, everyone keeps predicting he's going to fall out with Donald Trump very soon, and that therefore he may lose his interest in politics. Well, let's see. I think it's kind of undeniable that reform has momentum. I saw today, unless I misread it, just as I was coming in here, that Tim Montgomery, now many people won't know who this is, but I would say Tim Montgomery certainly used to be seen as really somebody who had his finger on the pulse of rank and file members. I don't know whether you Tory members, used to run Conservative Home and all the rest of it. Is that fair? And do you think that's an indication of, the Tory party looking towards reform?
Well, it is a fact that something like 90+% of Reform's vote came from Conservatives. And although some of those people will have historically voted for Labour, largely they came from Conservatives. And even going forward now, speaking to polling companies, they think the threat to Labour from Reform is actually not Reform taking Labour voters. It's people voting tactically on the right, either for Reform or the Conservative Party.
Anoushka, I've got to ask you, because you'll know this. It's something like 80 or 90 Labour seats where Reform are now second. So if Reform surge, right, if they surge, even if they're not taking the votes directly from Labour, that is still a lot of Labour candidates at risk from Reform.
It is massively on Labour's mind and they're thinking about it. I don't think they think that I think it's something around 80, all of them are at risk in that way, but there are certainly some where the margin is very, very tight, where there are Conservative votes that clearly stayed at home, and if those people vote tactically for Reform, it's going to be a big problem. And look, the thing with the Nigel Farage is, what we saw was a very kind of poor organisation in many ways, and he knows that. He was frustrated about the vetting process. I interviewed him at the time, and he said to me the person he was inspired by was Paddy Ashdown, the former Lib Dem leader from the 1990s, which I found fascinating, because what that tells me about Nigel Farage is he gets the first past the post system and he's looking for ways to try to exploit it, which is what Paddy Ashdown did with enormous success back in the 90s, and the Lib Dems have done it again in this election. And it says to me they are very serious about the way they are professionalising. He talked about if he did have that money, he would basically hire a network of professional campaigners across the country. He mentioned vetting as one of the things he wants to sort out. So clearly he would absolutely love that money. I mean, we do not have any limits on the amount an individual can give to a political party in this country. And Labour, in its manifesto, suggested that we need to look at those rules again. There was nothing in the first King's speech. I'm told it will come up over the Parliament. That report I mentioned from the IPPR that's suggesting a £100,000 cap. There have been suggestions Labour are interested in that, looking at it.
They might be a lot more interested now.
I mean, and other parties were saying to me, people from other parties were saying to me yesterday, if Labour thought that was serious, that 100 million, they would act immediately. But they are saying they don't think this is a priority and they can't move on it immediately. And one point to make, which is, and this might be enticing for Labour, but also very high risk because of what Robert's saying, is that Reform is more of a threat to the Conservative Party. So there's probably a little bit of them that thinks let Reform harm the Tories.
I got two questions, I guess. One is, do we think that kind of money would have a huge impact, or even a proportion of it would have a huge impact on British politics, or could it backfire a bit? I always tend to think of the British electorate as quite liking fair play. Now, that may be an exaggerated view of the way things are now, but I wonder if there's a possibility that it could, backfire on that front. And the second point I just wanted to ask about is, obviously Nigel Farage is very associated with Brexit. I think all the opinion polls tell us people aren't very happy with how that has worked out. But it doesn't seem to be harming him in terms of what momentum he has. So what do you think of that?
I mean, first of all, if you get that kind of money, I mean, we think of it in sort of marketing terms, but actually, for a new party like Reform, it allows you just to build a formidable machine. You have the ability at that point to hire in tremendously high quality consultants that allow you to vet your candidates. You can, create offices all over the country. It turns you from a sort of slightly raggedy insurgent into, a formidable fighting machine. And just to go back to the Tim Montgomery point, he is a serious political analyst. I think arguably in terms of spotting certain sort of populist trends over the last 10 to 15 years, actually been quite an important voice. The fact that he wants to join Reform, or has joined Reform, sort of tells you that they will increasingly be able to tap into expertise that isn't flaky.
Okay. As regular listeners will know by now, we record this podcast on a Wednesday around Prime Minister's questions. So here are some of the key exchanges from the chamber.
The leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
The Prime Minister knowingly appointed a convicted fraudster to be his Transport Secretary. What was he thinking?
Mr. Speaker, the previous Transport Secretary was right when further information came forward to resign. What a marked contrast to behaviour in the last 14 years.
Mr. Speaker, he's obfuscating, but I'm going to keep him on the topic. He owes the House an explanation. He said that the former Transport Secretary was only asked to resign after further information came to light. What was that further information?
I'm not going to disclose private conversations. Further information came to light. The Justice Secretary resigned. As I say, what a marked contrast.
He never answers any questions, and it looks like he didn't ask his Transport Secretary any questions either. The truth is, he appointed a person convicted of fraud to the Cabinet. The first thing she did was bung hundreds of millions of pounds in pay rises to her trade union friends. Wasn't this a fraud on the British people? He owes them an explanation. The country needs conviction politicians, not politicians with convictions.
Mr. Speaker, I gently remind her that 2 of her predecessors had convictions.
So those were some of the standout moments from PMQ. Straight afterwards, I asked Robert and Anushka about the respective performances of the Prime Minister and Kemi Badenoch. What do you reckon? I thought Keir Starmer was a bit more confident or punchy.
They both seemed to be felt like a score draw. I thought Badenoch and him were both sort of reasonably sort of confident. I mean, neither of them were exactly setting the place alight.
I was going to say a score draw that may not cut through to that many people.
Yeah, quite a low score draw.
But I was going to ask Anushka, because you're closer to this than I am. That was the first time I think that he's on the record. I think the first time he's on the record said himself that new information came to light that persuaded him to, sack her, let's be clear, accept her resignation.
Louise Haigh.
Yeah, Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary. Do you have any idea what this new information is?
Absolutely not. And Number 10 are insisting that there was new information. They don't say what it was. Sources close to Louise Haigh say she disclosed the conviction in full. I don't think she knows what the new information is. Just while this has been on, gone to sources in Downing Street, said, can you just give us a bit more information about this? And they say no, but promise you there is more information, which is
because
curious.
The point is, let's be absolutely clear. It's
a bit weird, isn't it, really?
He said it in the House of Commons, right?
There's new information.
Which means, we assume, since he's really hot on not lying to MPs, that there is other information. So what is it?
I mean, if the one thing that came out that I guess is separate to the conviction was the idea that there had been 2 or 3 incidents at her old job at Aviva where they had noticed that she had reported a missing or stolen phone. I assume it is something around that detail that he would argue was new. The difficulty for Keir Starmer
But is that true, that stuff? I mean, do we know it's true?
Well, we know that they believed it. We don't know that we know that they only actually looked into one incident, and that was the incident that we know about. The reason it's kind of quite interesting and curious is, if there wasn't new information, then forcing her to resign really only shines the light back on his judgment in not thinking that was an issue in the first place. I think the more realistic reason why they wanted Louise Haigh to resign was that there had been a few incidents in a row that had infuriated Keir Starmer. Apparently one being, which was mentioned by Kemi Badenoch in there, a payout to train drivers that was pretty big. And then the next day, another transport union said it was going on strike. Apparently the Prime Minister was really furious about that. They then clashed over P&O when she had suggested that perhaps people should boycott the ferry firm over kind of past employment questions. So I get the impression from those around her that they felt he just didn't want to spend any more political capital on her.
I felt Kemi Badenoch is getting a little bit better, maybe every week, a little bit more confident. Still looks very nervous, I have to say, when you look closely.
I actually thought she looked more nervous
Really?
this week than usual.
I mean, she doesn't get an answer. Keir Starmer never answers the question. He looked a bit less prickly to me than he sometimes does. He sometimes is very defensive, and he seemed like he was a bit more confident this week. But what I wanted to ask you both, and I know I've asked this before, in fact, I probably asked it last week, how much longer can he sit there saying, you know, X many billion black hole we inherited from you, blah, 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 blah. I mean, there's got to be a line beyond which you can't...
29.
So I'm going to ask you a question, which is, when are you going to
29?
stop asking us this question?
Well, when he stops using the ruddy line. I mean, it's
all right. So
boring.
So, I mean, look, they own the economy now because they've had this, you know, budget of 70 billion of tax cuts and borrowing increases. So they own the economy now. We've got another mega event coming up next year, which is the spending review, which appears to have now been shunted to June, which in many ways will be, I mean, I think arguably more important because, you know, they've set this, you know, so-called spending envelope of 1.3% for public service spending, 1.3% increase per year for public spending increases after 2026, and absolutely nobody who I speak to knows anything about the state of public finance, the state of public services thinks that's remotely realistic. You know, one of the things we're going to hear about tomorrow from the Prime Minister when he does his great not a reset. This is not a reset for folks. I'm just laying out the things that you didn't know that I'm going to do in this Parliament, but it's not a reset. Yeah. Anyway, he'll be laying these out. And then one of the big things he'll be saying a lot tomorrow is public services have to be reformed. And he will be saying the way that we get public services to be as good as they need to be without putting in yet more money is to reform them. But, I mean, we haven't yet got a clue about what that means in practice to, you know, the police or the courts or even the health service, even though we've got this plan coming for the health service, and, you know, whether they can really get the reforms in place so that public services don't feel like they're going through austerity again. I mean, goodness only.
A lot of people listening to this are going to think, okay, so my question is, are you saying that they're going to stick to the spending envelope and in effect this is going to mean cuts in quite a few places, quite a lot of places, because we're not sure about reform? Or are you saying that they're going to have to come back and raise taxes again, or possibly both?
Well, they're going to have to do both, aren't they? I mean, let's be absolutely clear. If they continue to give the health service the money that it needs, if they protect or indeed even marginally increase defence spending, there is zero for any other public service. Zero, right? Now, maybe a bit of reform will help some of those public services to do more with less, but
I think we've all been around long enough to be wary of that argument.
So the idea that they're not going to raise, honestly, the idea that they're not going to have to come back for more taxes, absent some economic miracle that suddenly sees the growth rate of the economy treble in the next year, note to everybody, that's not going to happen.
You mentioned,
so they are going to have to put taxes up.
I mean, you mentioned defence, and when you speak to Labour MPs, the way they try and frame it is that there has been this kind of massive shift in society, in the world, which is for years, for decades, there was a kind of agreement that we could spend less and less on defence, and that wasn't, you know, at anywhere level the need it had been earlier in the last century, and therefore we could improve public services, put money into public services, and now we have a situation where the demands of defence are rising, and that's going to go alongside public services which are really struggling. And so that is a difficult framing and not one that a new Labour government has had to come into before. So how do you deal with it? In terms of the messaging, that's why they keep banging on about the black hole and so on, because while we are politics watchers and we watch it a lot, and we've heard Keir Starmer say it God knows how many times, they are convinced, and we may not agree with this, but they are convinced that people don't hear it until you, Tom, are basically smashing that window with frustration. That's when the public hear it in their mind, and they think that in 2010 it didn't work until 2012. No, but the reality is we are going to hear him saying it for years. I think, how often does it actually get through to the sources where millions of people will watch it is a different matter.
But there is a huge difference here, right? And this is the strategic mistake that they made 4 months before the general election. For months before the general election. On this show, on News at 10, on the Peston Show, we said there is a black hole, and Labour denied it. You know, I've looked at an interview I did with Starmer during the election campaign, where I say to him, there is a 40 billion black hole, what are you going to do about it? And he denies it, right? He obfuscates, he refuses to engage.
And that's going
the
to affect
reason they're in a mess
trust.
in the way that, in the end, Cameron and Osborne, whatever you think of austerity, the point is they talked about Labour's spendthrift ways, profligacy that had to be reversed
before the election,
the election, or through the election.
That was their pitch.
Yeah, that was their pitch. But the point, the reason why people don't at the moment, the reason why people don't believe Starmer and Reeves, even though they're right, they did inherit a black hole, is because they say, well, why the hell didn't you talk about this before the election? It looks to British people who mistrust politicians like political game playing.
And they understood that.
This is a problem of their own making.
We need to move on to discuss a couple of other things, but I just want to ask you about that. Do you think they would have won the election as convincingly if they'd just been upfront and discussed it?
No, and they don't think they would have won it as convincingly.
I disagree. I completely disagree.
Can I say,
Okay.
they think that they would have had a massively
reduced.
They think they would have had a massively reduced majority. I think a massively reduced majority, but with more of an ability to maintain trust, was arguably a better place for them to be. Their response to that, when I put that to them, is a big majority gives you political stability at the moment, regardless of what it means for 2029. So that was their thinking. But clearly, if you want to maintain trust of voters, then the thing you don't do is go into an election pretending something doesn't exist when everyone is saying that it does exist. But you can then make an argument that the black hole was bigger than you thought it was, and that's what they're trying to do. Whether it's successful or not will take years to understand.
I have to say, I think the reverse of that. I think the public is capable of absorbing the reality.
But not only that, Tom.
And I think they would still have won big.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they would have won big. And I think, actually, the one incredibly important piece of evidence about all of this is that, and you talked about this night after night, on the Person Show, the big priority of the public was fixing the health service. If they had framed the tax discussion around the need to restore health services, then they could have had a credible programme that I think would have led them to just as big a majority as they got.
On the one hand, I don't disagree that that's how they should have framed it. Would it have made a difference to the majority? It's almost impossible for us to know for sure. But one thing is clear, is that the tax attack from Rishi Sunak on the Labour Party, in the ITV debate, which is where it was kind of at its peak, was seen as very damaging to the Labour Party. And they were really worried that that was going to make a difference. And so regardless of what we think, and maybe they could have won it anyway, and I think 100% it would have allowed them to have more trust now, the reality is they were convinced that this is what they needed to do to win big. And now they are reaping the consequences of that.
A counterfactual, obviously, we'll never know the answer to. Two quick issues I just wanted to discuss with you. We've seen the first train company, South West Railways, on the path back into public control. Some of us are old enough to remember British Rail. I know we're not, that's probably in...
All of us are old.
Yeah, old enough, yes, true. Probably in an exact parallel. What do you think? And this talk about British Steel being kind of brought back under public control, I feel like that's a whole different thing, a different argument, and probably less likely. But what do you think about this story generally?
Well, it's hugely popular. Bringing trains back into public ownership is just a hugely popular thing to do, and that's what they understand, because people have become
won't be popular if they don't work, though.
No, it won't. So obviously,
and that seems to me to be the crux of all of this. Have they got the management competence to run the railways properly? Because we were talking earlier about they own the economy now after the budget. They actually will own the railways, and if the railway service deteriorates or is even as bad as it is today, then they will pay quite a big price. And I think one shouldn't underestimate one of the reasons in the old days there were two arguments for privatisation in the old days that the Tories made. One of them, and this definitely worked for some industries. Telecoms would probably be one. They did actually become a better service, right? But the other reason why Tories quite like privatisation, and they definitely liked it in the shape of rail, was they could no longer be blamed quite so directly for a terrible service. But now this is Labour's problem.
One final question this week. I feel I have to ask because we talked about it a lot last week. That assisted dying vote was massive. You know, we talked about it being an extraordinarily important issue. MPs have opted for it. Do we take it as a given that it will now happen and can't be derailed? Where do you think we are after the vote?
Well, the majority was 55, so slightly bigger than some were expecting. And I would say that proponents of assisted dying think it's probably going to be enough to carry them over third reading. That said, there were a number of people, more than that gap in terms of the number of votes you would need to change, who said, including some MPs saying to me personally, I'm voting for it because I think it needs more time and it needs more discussion. I agree with it in principle, but I have my concerns. And certainly those who are opposed to it believe that the gap is narrow enough that they have an opportunity now to change people's minds. I mean, I spoke to Kim Leadbeater.
Just one point on that, though. There were some people who voted against not on principle, but because they thought the bill wasn't good enough. And so I think it is certainly possible that some people who voted against, if the bill improves, will vote in favour. So I think this is quite a complicated...
For what it's worth, some of the MPs I spoke to who voted for it argued that we couldn't have voted against it, they felt, to their constituents, and then change their minds as easily as going in the opposite direction. So what I'm trying to say is, I think likely it's going to pass third reading. I think there's clearly Parliament agrees with it in principle. Having spoken to Kim Leadbeater, whose private member's bill it was afterwards, there are going to have to be more safeguards, and those will come forward in amendments at committee stage. She's very open to that. You know, that said, I think there's going to still be huge debate. There were incredibly, as we all know, passionate speeches on both sides and very persuasive.
Can I ask you a question about what you think? And I think, actually, that whatever one's views about whether this is, the right piece of new law to address a very, very serious problem, I personally think politically for Starmer, I think this is bad news because this is so big in terms of public discourse. I think it'll crowd out quite a lot of other messages he wants to get out. I also think if it becomes law, and I think I'm right in thinking that written into the law is something like it then has to come into practice within, I think, 2 years, I think, is what it says. So it becomes law, and then, there's 2 years for this to start. The whole country, and it will be in the run-up to the election on tenterhooks about all of this. And I think if you're a government that wants to communicate about other issues, I think it makes it quite hard for you. What do you think?
I mean, I hadn't actually thought of that as a reason. I hadn't really thought about that at all. I mean, he believes in it, doesn't he? He wants to make this change. I guess and the public is something like 2/3 in favour in principle. I guess he could argue that it was going to be a big kind of change that he's made, a generational change. The one thing I would say is we're going to hear a lot of the anti-arguments, which are really passionate and really emotional, and those may change people's minds.
That's all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us, whether you are watching or listening. Remember, you can view new episodes on ITVX every Wednesday, and if you're enjoying it, please do hit subscribe on your favourite podcast platform to ensure you won't miss out on an episode.